You're listening to the Movidiam Podcast. Sign up for free at movidiam.com.
Hello and welcome to the Movidiam Podcast. I'm George from Movidiam, and today we're speaking with Elena Andreicheva. Elena, welcome to the Movidiam Podcast.
Thank you very much, George.
You've had a rather sort of fascinating, career as a filmmaker. Ukrainian born but based in the UK now, and carving out a niche for yourself, sort of producing sort of hard-hitting documentaries for British American TV. So tell us where it all started.
Gosh, I guess career-wise, I've had quite an unusual background coming into, now eventually making films. I actually studied potentially to be a scientist. I studied physics at university, and for no really apparent reason, just a vague interest in how the world works. And then I did some writing assignments and found that actually I was much more interested in expressing ideas in another way, sort of a lot less structured and kind of more creative. So to cut a long story short, I started working in media, I guess, through doing some research for a really interesting book about living off the grid. And it happened to have been written by a producer-director, and whilst I was doing that work, I helped out on some development projects and thought, wow, this documentary shtick is pretty interesting. And essentially kind of worked up from that.
It's very interesting, isn't it, how it's sort of one thing leads to another, and you're on a sort of creative journey and you sort of discover more about the format and the exposure you get, and that sort of stimulates the journey to a certain extent.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I certainly am not somebody who can say, ever since I was, really young, I wanted to make films. I certainly had an interest in imagery, in photography, but yet it all very much kind of fell into place, kind of domino by domino, if you know what I mean. And very, very subtly, I think, as well. Given my background in science, I started out doing a lot of documentaries on TV that were sort of, ostensibly kind of science-based, so they might have been about medicine. But really the things that really hooked me on those projects were kind of the geopolitical forces at play there. So, for example, one of my first research gigs was looking at counterfeit medicines in East Africa, and it just blew my mind, the really kind of less the science, more how that comes about and why. Sure.
When you dial into the subject, presumably you unearth more and more of interest, which develops the story.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So that's how I got hooked on much more kind of, character-led documentary films. So I moved fairly quickly from kind of science-related factual stuff to more access-based documentaries.
Really interesting. Just on that point, I know that you've liaised on Movidiam with Sam French, who's a very experienced documentary filmmaker and a very impressive individual who's worked extensively in Afghanistan as well. Somewhere that you're currently in production for.
Yes, that's right. So that's a kind of a tricky one. I can't say too much about it.
Sure. No.
Just to really whet the appetite. We're due an announcement quite soon, hopefully. But yes, so it's a really interesting project. I've been working with young women in Kabul on a film that's going to look at their engagement with sport and kind of hopefully some stories of empowerment coming out of that. So yeah, it was fantastic. Actually, I've been on Movidiam for a little while, and I got an email with Sam's podcast, and I listened to that and thought, wow, I should really speak to him, and we did, and it was wonderful. And lots and lots of advice and context came out of that. And with a location like that, you really need all the help you can get. I was starting completely from scratch.
Sure.
And I feel it's really important if you're the one who's producing, a film in a location like that, and you're in charge of, setting up all the protocols. You've got to do all your own legwork, and yeah, he was incredibly helpful.
It's interesting, isn't it, how, more and more these sort of tools and services such as Movidiam are beginning to sort of facilitate the filmmaking journey, whether it's in the research phase or whether it's finding team members or even just organising the vast amount of sort of data that's kind of gathered throughout the course or the longevity of a production.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think, every now and again, there's a sense, in the filmmaking community, sort of friendly and open as it is, that, sometimes people with really privileged information, so, real experience of working in challenging environments, there's this sort of sense of guilt about that I certainly get, just calling, journalists and filmmakers up and saying, I'm going to pick your brain, or can I pick your brain? I'm normally more polite than that. And I felt, especially with the connection through Movidiam, that I felt that, maybe it could be a reciprocal sort of thing. And I think the more we can do that, hopefully, the better, those relationships can be, and they can grow into, maybe collaborations at some stage, not just, a quick call and then, okay, bye-bye, I'll never see you again, and I won't keep touch.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you touch on a sort of very sort of subtle sort of human interest style sort of reciprocity issue, which is together in a sort of niche network where you never know when you might need each other again. It's quite an interesting one, and I think without networks and without this sort of forum for conversation about your specialism, in this case filmmaking or remote locations, it's I agree that they're lost in the ether of many different channels of communication.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that you don't have to sort of send each other emails all the time, sort of updating. You can just you're on each other's radar. That helpful, because as I'm sure every filmmaker or any freelancer will say, you have once you're in a project, you're in a project, and then when you finish, sometimes there is that sort of guilt about abandonment of all your contacts, which. Sure. It's a real shame, given the.
Well, I think what's interesting as well, certainly looking into other industries where perhaps you go for one interview and then join a job for a 5 or 6 or 10 year period. As a film project, sometimes they're picked up and put down over a 2 or 3 or even a 10-week period. So therefore, the picking your brains question in other industries happens perhaps once, whereas in the filmmaking industry, or it's project by project, and so that sensitivity to asking too much before you're giving anything in return is quite a challenging one. And I suppose at the beginning of your journey as a student filmmaker wanting to get into a professional role or some exposure, there's a lot of asking, and there is no formal structure per se once you've come out of the educational sort of institutions. No, absolutely. There just isn't. And, you have different experiences with different people. For example, if someone calls me up about something, I'm always very happy to say, mostly because I feel, I don't know, obviously I'm still starting out on that journey, so it's repaying it to the world.
Yeah, exactly.
So Elena, you also work sort of part-time or full-time now at Grain Media, where there's obviously a huge number of fascinating projects. Do you find that your job and role there is because of your interest, or how did that come around, and your decision to sort of take a project there as opposed to in a different sort of commercial entity?
So actually, I know the guys at Grain through a mutual contact, a director that I work with, Zara Hayes, who introduced me to Orlando. Who's one of the heads of Grain, and we really got on in terms of our interests in filmmaking. Grain is a very interesting production company that works with documentary, but also narrative films, and and a lot of corporate and commercial work as well. For me, the documentary side obviously is of huge interest, and Orlando is such a great filmmaker and someone who's really, really good to talk about documentary stuff and ideas with. And I was really drawn to that and being in that environment. But also being somebody who could bring something to the company and kind of, help fill out the documentary side of their output. So one of the things that I really enjoy about being there at the moment, working on very specifically the Afghanistan project, but in a less sort of, I guess, formal capacity, being somebody who's always kind of churning out, new ideas and kind of pushing the documentary side of the output, I suppose.
Sure, interesting. So it's a very, so it's interesting how, people find their sort of niche and specialism, whether it's, the documentary from far afield or commercial work. And I think bridging the gap at Grain between this heavily commercial work, but also these fantastically fascinating stories that actually the whole world needs to hear and be exposed to.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible to be able to pull off, just one, really high impact documentary project, like a big feature like Virunga, for example.
Yeah.
So obviously when a company has done that, obviously that wasn't just Grain, but when they've been so instrumental in doing that, everybody comes to them trying to pull off very similar projects. By similar, I mean, big independent sort of ideas. So it's tricky because on the one hand, everybody wants to make a big feature doc, that's great. But they're so incredibly difficult to get made. So, I think that, kind of we're working towards, having that output, but also working up more documentary ideas that are also for broadcast. It's all, it's a very exciting time at the moment, with loads of ideas sort of kicking about in that respect as well. And, with my experience kind of in television, that I think that's quite handy. But yeah, no, it's a really exciting time actually. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your time in television before you kind of ventured out on your own and got more sort of producing roles in places like Grain.
Okay, so basically, sort of after the initial work in factual documentaries and series, I got involved with a company called Nerd TV, who made two very interesting projects that really kind of helped me carve out a new path, the kind of access path. So one was actually a discovery series about prison gangs, which sort of sounds, very format and sort of, the usual. But it's actually, the first series and the first time the presenter was working. It was a first-time presenter, and absolutely fascinating getting access to gangs that operate in prisons, and then kind of moving on from that and the subject of incarceration. I worked on a project called 12-Year-Old Lifer, which was quite a big film for Channel 4 and A&E in the US, and it was all about juvenile justice, and it was about two very young boys that they were convicted of a murder, and essentially potentially locked up for life. So those two projects really set me up on the path to kind of, I guess, documentaries that go after access that's very difficult, or speak to people that are, not that easily represented in film. So kind of criminal elements, etc. And so to that end, I worked on a few of the drugs links for National Geographic. Again, that's quite tricky because you're trying to get access not only to the police, but also to people who are using drugs and people who are selling them drugs and all this sort of thing.
Sure.
Which was it was an incredible experience. I would say that was a very crucial experience for me in terms of sort of where I wanted to go and the voices that I wanted to kind of represent in film.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I mean, hard to access, hotspots around the globe. Tradecraft is incredibly important, isn't it? And it's very difficult to teach this, how you actually pull off, that particular access point or what leverage you're using or what interpersonal skills you are. But there isn't a rule book, is there?
No, I mean, yeah, no, it's a really great point. No one sort of tells you, and every time that you start a new project and you look at, let's say your kind of list of things you'd ideally like to achieve, you sort of think, oh my God, is that actually going to happen? And then bit by bit, you find yourself, actually in that situation, talking to that person, filming with that person. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's a huge challenge, but I think I think that the odd thing I found time and time again is that a lot of people say you can't do that. You can't. You that person will never talk to you. All these things. They say this all the time. Or even
red rag to a bull.
exactly. But I think at the start of maybe a career doing that, when you're talking to a lot of, let's say, organizations that are working with very vulnerable people, let's say, and you might call them up and they'll say, you know what, you'll never get that access, and you're thinking, well, of course I trust you because you work with these people day in day out. But what I found that as a filmmaker, you can go much deeper, and not always, and it doesn't mean you sort of have to be pushy or anything, but you can. I think if you try, you quite often find that you can. Why that is I it's hard to say, but I think some genuine kind of face-to-face engagement with someone, and I think the sense that someone once said to me, you'll never convince someone if you don't believe it. So I don't believe in this kind of sort of inventing a reason for someone to take part. If you don't believe that reason, you're never going to convince them.
Sure, that's very interesting. So you've got to have a subject matter with which you are totally aligned, and a voice which you are, really wanting to share. Because I'm sure that there are other productions and producers out there that know how to leverage that interview dynamic or the expertise on camera, or massage that situation to get an outcome. But it's a very interesting point. You've got to be totally subscribed and involved with the subject matter, because you invest and live with it for such a long period of time.
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're like as a person. Of course, I'm sure there are people who are much more, who are perfectly comfortable knowing that, that they're able to some degree, manipulate a situation to get the desired outcome. But I feel, even if you can, doesn't, mean you should.
It doesn't necessarily work, because there is something that, that comes across if there's an ounce of deceit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that. I mean, maybe some people are, again, fantastic kind of, manipulators of that, and you can't tell. That, simply for me, that isn't the case. And sort of, to be able to then move on and kind of live with that, to me, it's really important to feel like I've been, quite straight up about how I'm approaching things.
Yeah, sure.
Having said that, of course, when you're in the thick of it and you're maybe having the interview, there is a real pull to get what you want and to maybe follow that kind of manipulative
thread. Yeah, sure. Well, I think, we've all been there as filmmakers. The hairs on the back of the neck go up when something is unfolding, which perhaps is more often than not, it's unexpected. And that is an exciting sort of, dopamine hit, effectively. And I understand that. And I think that in turn does make very, very good watching.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of, it's why we do it, I suppose. And it doesn't have to be, I find it doesn't have to be a huge event or some massive sort of drama. It can be a very small kind of, human reaction that means volumes.
Sure.
I get a real kick, out of that. So
I think interesting is as the filmmaker, you've got the context of audience and distribution, which the subject at that time, at that stage of the production, might not have. Because it dialed in or beamed in on that situation for half a day or whatever it is, and they just don't have the same context that you might have to having produced or pre-produced it for several months.
Yeah, that's always quite. You have to keep reminding yourself that your contributor or contributors are just in a completely different world, their world, just getting on often with what they're doing, and you've got all these sort of insane plans for Act 3, or and or whatever, and that's always, I find that quite quite sort of interesting to think about and try and reconcile in your head.
Yeah. Do you find that your sort of your background and sort of contrast that you've had in your life today has just sort of informed and helped you in terms of how you navigate sort of new worlds when you beam into them?
I mean, yeah, I would say, I don't know if this is just a narrative I've created for myself, but I would say yes, definitely, absolutely. It's it's the idea that you can. It's not just the idea, I think, that you can fit in wherever, especially if you have a personality that's quite, diplomatic and kind of, amenable, shall we say. But also the idea that no one differs from you by that great a degree. I think that's the thing that I find probably easiest in terms of then making, connections with people in places that seem kind of very far away from where I come from.
Yeah.
Definitely. I was 11 when I moved to the UK, and the UK is not that different to Ukraine in so many ways. But I from that age upwards, I grew up with a lot of kids from all over the world, and I think that was really valuable, and that definitely informs the way I am
Operating.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you can beam in and beam out of different tribes.
Yeah.
Good. Very interesting. And tell us what should we just quickly recap to sort of Polish Go Home as well, because that was one of sort of your directorial debut, and you've actually had a fair bit of success on the sort of festival circuit there as well. Can you just briefly touch on where that came from and whether that's going to come back to life? Sure.
So obviously, that film came very much out of my background. So Polish Go Home is a film about a Polish immigrant here in London, and his decision and his journey to go back to Poland after 4 years of being away from his family. So for quite a few years, I would say, I'd been wanting to say something about immigration, given my background. And it was very common for people not to know where I'm from and to make comments that I sort of thought were a bit questionable. Why are they coming over here? What's going on? Why would you do that? And I really felt that I wanted to kind of show or explain that people don't move because it's extremely easy and brilliant. It's actually really, really difficult to leave your family, to leave your home. And I sort of thought, okay, well, I'm going to find a person who, to most people, in the UK, is the definition of an undesirable immigrant, and I'm going to try and make them care about that person. So the Polish Go Home, at the heart of Polish Go Home, is kind of this anti-hero, I guess. And it was quite a simple task, I guess. So I just thought, okay, I'll find this person and try and humanize them, and see what happens. And that's what the film came out of.
And it obviously chimed with people, and the festival circuit.
Yeah, I mean, it's been quite a slow burner of a project for me, because it feels like it's been going on forever. It's been about 3 years, I guess, and I finished the film in March last year, so kind of finally finished, completed, having shot it over 2 years. And it's great. So we were at Aesthetica last year, which was really great, kind of a big highlight from last year. And this year we've got screenings in Eindhoven coming up, and in Vancouver, and there's hopefully a whole list of other festivals that we'll be able to make it to, which should be fantastic. And it's a kind of a weird, it isn't a film that's it's quite niche, I guess. Its style is very kind of earthy, I would say. It's not a very sort of particularly high concept documentary in terms of form, or anything else. But the one thing that I'm really happy about is that everyone, if they watch it, they really want to know more, and I think they care.
Sure. Well, I certainly got that from watching the trailer. You do dial in. You think, well, you want to know more, and I think you've cut that trailer very, very well indeed.
Thank you. My trailer cutting is yes, that was a new role for me. It's funny how when you're sort of, the captain of your own boat, you realize all these things that you have to do and become knowledgeable about, the festivals, the trailer, the sound mix, and you realize, my goodness, like, I'm so glad that there are people who actually know how to do this, and moving forward, to be able to actually work with people whose specialism that is, that's been super good.
Well, that's again a very useful touch point to refer to Movidiam, because it's all about finding niche skills. A drone pilot, an editor, visual effects artist, and with tens of thousands of production companies and individuals profiling on the site now, you can really begin to build a very, very high caliber team, almost immediately. Which I think is an exciting new way of collaborating for filmmakers and people wanting to create computer games and create visual effects worlds and ultimately, visual content.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's and often someone who's either kind of working independently on quite a small scale or starting out, you feel like you have to be all things. But actually, I would say that it's been the times in my career so far where I've worked with real specialists and professionals that I've learnt the most. So yes, making an independent film on your own is great and you learn an absolute ton, but so do you, working with other people.
Yeah. Well, Elena, it's a full 30 minutes. And I know you've probably got a very busy day ahead of you, so I'll let you go. But thank you so much for your time on the Movidiam podcast. That was Elena Andreicheva, and we look forward to sort of following up your progress and indeed your work at Grain and your freelance career. Thank
you very much, George. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to the Movidiam podcast. Sign up for free at movidiam.com.